shifted.
Yeah.
What's happening, bro?
How are you?
Uh, Good. How are you?
Doing really well.
I'm just
Okay.
letting people know because I didn't announce this on my Instagram account. Um, so anyway, we're doing an Instagram live. We're talking about I think we're talking about cold blow and a lot of that stuff centered around cold. This is Jeff Sorensen with Breath Army, an old friend. It's been a long time, brother. How are you?
I- I'm doing great. Yeah, it's prime cold dipping season here in Canada right now. It's beautiful spring and feels like
Walk the water, bro.
feels like it's good conversation to have right now. It seems like there's a lot of controversy and misinformation in this space. So felt
Yeah,
like it would be.
it's interesting what I've seen. I don't know how many people here have witnessed it, but I didn't even really know anything was really going on until Nafel and my team kind of notified me of some stuff going on, and then they sent me one of Andrew's posts about it, and it was interesting because I loved his his explanation of things, but I saw something from a scientist who I actually know, who who talked about the differences in like women and men and how women shouldn't be doing cold plunging too cold because of how they respond to cold in a much more stressful way than men. And I instantly was like, whoa, um, like I got to dig in and see where she's coming up with that. And I actually found some information on that. However, um, the reality of what I understand and what I've also dug into in hearing this is women actually respond to cold far better than men do at first, and can actually respond far quicker with their physiology. It's just they have a heightened stress response that comes, but they actually, because women carry more body fat, etc., they have an increase in brown adipose tissue, which actually gives them that unique advantage that men don't have, and men have to make up for through shivering, right? Anyway, so here we are talking about cold and what the differences and how people what's going on with some of the controversy around cold plunging, et cetera, et cetera. And we're both pretty uh, dialed into the kind of cold game since we've both been at it for quite some time.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that came up even in watching Andrew's video is, like with all of these practices, we like to kind of pigeonhole, and create methods around it.
Yeah.
And we start to overlook the nuance and the personal experience, the individual experience that people are having with it. And we can even get lost in the science or in the studies and overlook our own personal experience, and recognizing that direct experience and having a foundation of awareness to be able to read our own nervous system and to be able to determine where we're at on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment basis, and how we're approaching that practice is kind of like the primary place that we want to start looking from.
Yeah, I couldn't I don't disagree with any of that. And that's one of the things that science isn't ever going to be able to really pull out. Science gives it kind of a points in a direction towards things that we can go and look at or see. So, and the individual will definitely um, response to these things is really really important because the reality is I mean with what I've seen with cold plunging over the last 15 or so years, you know and that's like it's people in the thousands.
Mhm.
Uh, the people who have the most adverse response, if we were talking about sexes, would be male.
Mhm.
Um, Granted, it's younger men typically, or more reactive men, um, in that they don't have a whole lot of emotional control over things, which plays a huge part into something that is such a high stress response. But that being said, what I've found over the years that, cold exposure in and of itself can also be, there's a lot of people I've found doing it probably shouldn't be doing it quite yet. And then there's people who could really use a good dosing of it every single day, who aren't getting enough of it, right? And that's that nuance in the
Mhm.
whole thing where, getting in an ice plunge for 3 minutes or whatever the new trendy thing is that that does not apply anywhere in how I apply this. And it's all about how do you regulate and how can you control regulation, in so that you are actually getting what it is you're intending to get out of this thing, right? So that it can play a huge role, in how you're managing stress as a whole. And that's any training I look at this point.
Yeah, well, and I think, like something that gets overlooked in terms of cold exposure is that it's extremely addictive, and there's opioids, cannabinoids, endorphins, and so again, that can kind of mask and seduce people towards the practice when maybe they don't actually need to be doing the practice. And then for the people that could maybe use less, there's so many different ways to approach the practice. And I think oftentimes people associate cold exposure with an ice bath or a cold plunge in a natural body of water. And for those people who might not be benefiting from sitting in an ice bath for 2 or 3 minutes, they may really benefit from kind of like microdosing their cold exposure using different methods.
Oh,
And there's
100%.
a
Yep.
lot of different ways to approach that practice, which really at its core, apart from all of the physiological benefits that everybody tends to lean on, there's so much opportunity to expand that emotional resiliency, the emotional capacity, and to be able to create some more capacity within the nervous system just by wearing less clothes, going for a walk with bare feet on cold ground, splashing cold water on the face or putting your face in cold water. And a lot of people forget about all these different ways that we can approach the practice. And I think a lot of this conversation and kind of controversy has come from the somatic world of nervous system healing, which is incredibly important, and yet it's kind of like a very kind of soft or like feminine approach to healing the nervous system, and I feel like kind of like this devouring mother archetype, kind of comes into that. And it's like, well, this is good for you. Don't do this. Don't do that. That's bad for you. You shouldn't be doing that. When there's, a more masculine kind of direct confrontational way of, in an intelligent way, expanding that nervous system capacity through discomfort. But we have to be mindful about the ways that we approach it.
Yeah. I mean, the simple way I of what I just heard is let people explore this for themselves. I put up a quote the other day I heard from a buddy of mine, Dr. Tim Brown, and he's like, my buddy gave me this quote, so I don't know the guy's name, but it was like, I don't fucking care what the truth is, I just want to know it. you know, and you know, uh, a lot gets, you know, there's a lot of issues when people take up strategies as a whole for everybody and what's safe for everybody or what's not. You know, I'm an adult, you're an adult, and we're here to do some things. And although we're looking for guidance and a path, if that path is led by a, you know, even a too gentle of a hand, that person's going to be, you're going to see codependency as one of the factors that rises out of something like that, right? Whereas the other side of it is just, you know, somebody who's absolutely you know, just like too self-absorbed to listen, just wants to drive and do things on their own and break things all the time. It's, you know, which is more of a category I like to fit into. Uh, that said, you know, I don't know that there's anything that's been, you know, any community more than the somatic community that's kind of messed things up for a lot of people, especially the world at large, in terms of where we are directionally currently, and having sides to things, et cetera, and where it's like certain methodologies evolve out of things, and this is the thing to do and how you do it, and that's a part of all of that. There is no one single path out of it, but the cold is quite an interesting thing because when I look at cold as a stressor, I don't like the time, like the, the the direct comment that was made that women don't need as cold of water that I saw as men. In fact, they should go in like 55-degree water. Or, you know, they only need 50. That is not is a that had to have been a clip because that's utter BS. Men could be in 55-degree water. I body surfed in 55-degree water for 45 minutes and came out almost hypothermic. So, like, just so we're clear. But when we start to look at the physiology of sexes in and of itself, the reality is women are actually built for the cold. And although women tend to feel cold more than men, that is not a reason why women would adapt to heat better than men, and they don't adapt. And that was another comment that I've heard, is that women actually do better in the heat. That is incorrect. Women can do well in a sauna. However, women lack the sweat pores that men actually have to combat exercise, or if we were to go back in time, persistent hunting something over a very long period of time and being able to handle that. Whereas women do not have that, carry more body fat, which insulates them. And then, you know, and I like to look at things like performance. And well, what do the top performers in these things look like? And when you look at cold water swimming, there are women at the top. Like across, Lynn Cox has some of the greatest world records in cold water swimming. Men don't have it, right? And then in all of the heat related events at this point that are extreme endurance, women are not at the top. Women are in endurance events and do well in endurance events and extreme endurance events, but they don't do as well. At any rate, Nafel's asking if we can answer a couple questions here. And let me scroll back to a question. There's a lot of, wow.
How do you determine if you're ready to undertake a cold plunge?
You go get in the cold and then see how long you can last, see how long you can work through that. You know, and I mean, that's my first response. You go give it a whirl. Go jump in a cold shower. Go outside when it's cold, like you suggested. Jeff, you want to answer some of that?
Well, I think we can only, you know, like exactly as you're saying, try it and then see what your experience is. We can only really truly learn from direct experience. We can watch all the videos and read all the studies, but we're never really going to know until we try it. And
Yeah.
then
Well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
and then we try it for a period of time, and we start to notice trends in our energy, in our performance, in the way that we feel. And then we can start to modify that practice in the ways that we need to in order to be able to hone it in for what our individual body and nervous system requires.
Correct. Yeah, and I think that, and that leads into the next question that was asked about, is it enough to use the cold or heat just to simply feel better? And while that might be, like, I'm not here to tell you what's right or wrong necessarily. There are failure points that I look at, or there are points of limitation, where constraint picks up. One of those is just to change how you feel without understanding a lot of what is in front of feeling. There is no feeling without context. You need an internal verbal dialogue that occurs outside of immediate direct sense, right? Like, so if I get in the cold and I get the cold shock, that's an immediate direct thing occurring. However, the byproduct following that becomes, oh, I feel so good.
Mhm.
Well, why do we feel so good? What about this is changing things? Well, I just feel like crap, and I just want to feel better. Well, that's perfectly fine. Why do you feel like crap? What's the impetus of that? And where are the constraints around something like that? As you were just talking about, like
Mhm.
like, hey, how am I using this, and what is it teaching me about how I'm recovering from other things? Is my sleep improving? Is my mood improving? Am I slowing down? Am I more patient? But the reality is most of us are coming on to a platform like this, or digesting some sort of podcast that somebody put out, and we're getting this information in a very short period of time that would have normally required us an enormous amount of time and patience to actually come to conclusions about doing or learning enough to understand how to apply that and how to begin that thing. So now it's well, how do I do this? What do I do? Like, give me the thing, give me the fix, right? And that's the byproduct of everything we're doing at this point. Versus, hey, I'm gonna go dose myself with this and see how it fits. Well, how long do I have to do that? I don't know. I don't have that answer, right? You're not paying me to look at your physiology on a daily basis and start to dose you with that stuff to understand all the details of your life and how you're responding to things, et cetera, et cetera. But that's your path towards your own science project.
Mhm.
And
Well,
I,
and I feel like a big piece of this too is people's individual goals. And if somebody wants to feel good for 5 minutes, then that's their MO.
yes,
If they want to feel better in their life, then they may need to take a deeper look at all of the different things that they're doing. And I'm sure that you've worked with high performers that aren't willing to sacrifice different ways of showing up in the world because they feel that they need to be attached to that identity in order to show up and to continue to perform at the level that they want to. And they might just want to feel good for 5 minutes, and that's
correct.
okay, right? That's their choice. And what we can also do is bring more awareness to there may be more to it, and there may be more that you want to look at, but whether you do that or not, that's your choice.
Absolutely. Yes. 100%. Like, and with high performers, it's a very, whether they're athletes or, wherever, it is a very, very, you need to step carefully
Mhm.
as that stripping of an identity could literally change the course of a lot of things and how they go about their process, right?
Mhm.
And not that I'm, I'm a kind of more like anti-identity guy, but however, like I'm not going to play the game that like we all don't ebb and flow inside of that world a lot.
Mhm.
At any rate, um, can you talk about? There's a question about. Can you talk about uh, cold exposure for a client? Um, oh, Brian, can you talk about where you do not suggest cold exposure for a client? Yeah, yeah, for sure. So, as a general statement, um, most of the type A males that I deal with don't really need a whole lot of cold exposure. Um, HRV is typically pretty sky high, and then they typically pretty quickly, and this is how I know, they pretty quickly get caught in the addictive loop of cold plunging,
Mhm.
and that's the thing.
Mhm.
And they're just charging all day long as hard as they can go, and they're like the cold plunge in the morning, the tight CrossFit next or real super high intensity as their workout, and then they're working their brains out all day long, and then they can't unwind at night, right?
Mhm.
These are typically individuals that I'll try and get to use heat a bit more of, as that'll be a more of a definitely a down regulatory experience for those individuals.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, and again, it's just identifying the individual, what they need, where they're at, and and recognizing that every day is different, and those stress levels and requirements are going to go up and down, and being able to monitor on a day-to-day basis what we're at, where we're at, and what we need, and again, being able to modify that practice in different ways can support on some of those days where we might not need an ice plunge, but still utilizing a practice in order to bring us into a higher degree of awareness, which is going to translate into the rest of the day, could still be a helpful practice. And so
Yes.
there's so many different ways to approach it. And I wanted to circle back to that piece around, is it okay to do it just to feel better? And I think that's such an important one, and so much to peel back on that one for so many people, because the question becomes, well, why do we want to feel better? And and also, could we feel better with what we're feeling right now? And and again, that's where cold exposure is a powerful tool to be able to get to those deeper layers of resistance to discomfort. And so if I'm resisting that discomfort and I'm in a state where I'm constantly stressed, I'm constantly not okay with what I feel, then there's so much to unwrap there and so much to learn about the ways that we meet life. And there's many ways to go about that, not just cold exposure. We can learn about that through heat. We can learn about that through exercise. We can learn about that just through sitting in that discomfort and doing nothing. But that's such an opportunity for growth, is to be able to look at that piece of, why am I seeking a way to feel better?
Don't disagree with that one. um, there's a question about if you Jeff can think of an occasion where you had people attend a retreat and the cold was not an option for them that day.
I've had lots of people come to retreats, and in any type of experience like that, I give full agency to the participant. There's never any forcing, never any coercion. to do anything. And so there might be times when somebody comes to a retreat and decides that's not what they want to do that day. But more than often, by the time we go through the whole group, probably that person will decide that maybe they want to get their toes wet and maybe they want to get their legs in the water. Maybe they even want to sit down, or there might be the person that sits down wants to get out right away and you let them get out. And that's actually a huge win for them because they actually did the thing. And then again, by the time we've gone through everybody else, they may decide that they want to get in again. You know, of course, there's contraindications around who may not be suitable for that practice, whether it's pregnancy or heart disease or whatever it might be. There's certain individuals that aren't suitable for that practice. But for most people, even just having that agency and flexibility within the practice to be able to approach it on their own terms is enough to, within a group of other people that are participating in that practice, and they're able to see the benefits that those other people are getting, oftentimes that's enough to convince that person that maybe there's something to explore there.
Love it.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
Yeah. I feel like another big one that came out was kind of like a misunderstanding around something that Peter Attia said lately. And he was in an interview where it came up around people working out and cold exposure blunting muscle hypertrophy. And, and Peter didn't say that it was a direct contraindication. He said that you want to be mindful of when you're doing that. And so I thought maybe that might be something that we could talk about as well, is just how to approach that for people that are working out that don't want to blunt their gains from their workout, but still want to engage in cold exposure.
Yeah, that's an easy one from my end.
Yeah.
If you stop the inflammatory process of something, okay, which is what jumping in the cold will do at first, okay, you're retarding the process of that growth cycle. So I look at it. I look at everything as stress. Like how do we look at this? There's a stimulus. We go through this stimulus cycle where there's the cold. That's the stimulator. There's the nervous system's immediate response to that. I feel cold. So there's an immediate reaction to that. That is an unconscious, that is as much you as anything. However, it's completely unconsciously driven. There are multiple things that are occurring in that nervous system response that lead to the neurotransmitter, hormonal drive, all of that, and the changing of behavior or the behavior that follows that. The interesting part about this last part of that stimulus response is that right in there is where the mind gets into it. And there's a dialogue that we all carry in how we're doing it. And it's not just adrenaline per se, right? That I have dialogue around. It's the event that's going on, like I'm getting into the cold plunge or whatever, and there's this dialogue that's going on. Then we move through this stress response. So part 3 of the stimulus response becomes part 1 of the stress response. The stress response then, so I go into the cold, and here's this thing that's happening, and I'm got my head involved now in my mind, and I'm sitting in there for 3 minutes, or I'm controlling my breathing, or I'm feeling my way through this. And then there is the finishing of said response, right? And so I get out of that response. This is where the growth phase begins. This is where, and if you were to look at like weight training, right, that is where the anabolic signaling begins. This is where the inflammatory process is happening. far too many people don't understand, haven't taken the time to walk through this to understand, but all of us have been through it in some capacity and can relate to it. In that, if I retard that growth process or I stop that growth process, that is where chronic stress begins. And so the new stress response begins again, and I stop, and I actually have inhibitory hormones, etc., that begin to stop that growth phase, right? And that is what you would be doing in something where if I'm doing some sort of training that is provoking some sort of growth cycle, so think of aerobic training or cardio training as catabolic. So that would be a positive for something like cold versus an anabolic, where I'm doing some sort of strength and conditioning, right? Training or MMA fighting, right? Or whatever, right? There's going to be some sort of growth phase afterwards. Getting into the cold after that is inhibiting that response. So this is where and why we want to separate that and take the time to understand how we recover. The fitter you get, the shorter that recovery cycle becomes, and you can actually induce that new stressor sooner. However, what the general consensus is for things like strength training or weight training is it's like a 48-hour window that you've got. And so you want to be careful of that window in bringing in something like cold, which will inhibit and bring on these hormones and neurotransmitters that are going to block that stress, that growth kind of cycle phase of the stress response. So that's basically the poor man or dumb man's version of like kind of how we would go about looking at this. And so, at least how I look at it, and then how I'll what I do talks about, because most people when I go and do talks, it's like I'm speaking to crowds of people who are in business and are, doing a lot. Mm-hmm. And they don't realize how they're going about multiples of the amount of things that they're adding into things. The biohacking community is notorious for this. It's just you're adding in so much stuff mm-hmm. that you're not actually doing a whole lot, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And at any rate, that's what I do. What I'll do with cold, with something, but you get somebody who's an endurance athlete or doing cardio, and yeah, you can introduce the cold pretty quickly after, because there is no real inflammatory process through that. There's no real growth cycle per se that would be inhibited through that cold process. Now, you could inhibit that process if you were to go get in the cold and stand there for too long, but you want to be careful too, because things have vasodilated. You've got much more blood flow going. There's a lot of blood flow out on the periphery, right? Mm-hmm. And just going and hopping in the cold ocean or cold water after doing something where you've been heated up can really bring on that after drop effect, where you can really screw yourself and bring on hypothermia quite quickly. I've seen it. I've done it years ago. I've done it, and I've done all this stuff. So, I've hit roadblocks and not all that stuff. But at any rate, that's how I look at that.
Well, I feel like that clears that one up for people. But I feel like one key piece that jumped out to me in your explanation is taking the time to understand what we're doing and how often that's not done. And, as you spoke to the biohacking community, and just this mentality of how many things can I do because of all of the purported benefits that I've read somewhere or watched on an Instagram clip that I'm going to get out of doing all these different things, and then stacking them all on top of one another, as opposed to taking the time to either do your own research or to be able to separate the individual practices enough to be able to get an idea of the trends within your own experience of how is this affecting me
Yeah.
and how do I need to modify this
Yeah.
practice, you know, but not to override everything that you just said, which is obviously super important information for people to understand in a general sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because there's many things out there that people don't realize could be doing more damage than they're good. And one of the more kind of expensive but trendy things is hyperbaric chambers. And yeah, I have one, and I've used hyperbarics for a number of years at this point, and I've consulted and have friends that are very well versed, know this far better than I. And one of those things is like you don't want to do something like cardio and then go jump in a hyperbaric chamber, or it's like you're really not helping how that oxygen's working in the system. Then you're overloading it, and you're kind of retarding the response of something that you were trying to create, because the over oxygenating of something is typically a hormetic effect. Like,
Mm,
there's big confusion. I'm looking at a product right now that does similar, but it's not a chamber, right? But it's over oxygenated. It's bringing on more oxygen to the system. And one of the questions I had for these guys, and it's an expensive product, but was hey, is this a hormetic effect? And they didn't know what I was talking. What they didn't understand what I was
mm,
asking, and I'm like, oh, they don't understand how oxygen works. It can be quite damaging getting in excess, which is why over breathing, as we know, can be a problem for a lot of people long term. Not maybe acutely or short term in a practice, but long term, if you're over breathing, you're diluting CO, so you're getting rid of CO2, and you're creating more O2, and then you're more apt to the damages of what oxygen can do inside the system, which is essentially, it's becoming a superoxide and like free radicals, etc.
mhm.
At any rate, I'm kind of digressing off of the cold piece, but the cold fits right in here, in that,
Yeah.
the cold is one of those things that it's like, where do I fit it in? And it's probably best, as, you know, Andrews suggested, at least in the morning for people, and then getting out and moving around or getting some light, and then you know like getting a small dose of it is going to drive up a lot of those hormones, neurotransmitters that are essential for living in this modern day life that we're depleting,
Mhm.
right? But again, if there's a weekend around and I don't have a lot to do, I do love doing multiple cold plunges and going into the sauna multiple times.
Yeah.
At any rate, so time and a place for it.
Yeah. Well, and I think, like in so many ways, we're in the Wild West right now, and you spoke earlier to the fact that many of these things we would have learned through a lineage, through a very long period of time without different external influences coming in to kind of cloud that individual practice. And now we've got access to all of these different things. As you said, there's people making products that don't even really understand the product that they're making,
Oh,
putting them out. And we have access to all of this.
oh,
And it brings it back to individual responsibility and discernment, and taking the time to do the research, taking the time to understand what we're doing. And we can make it really, really complicated. And yet, like you just shared about Andrew, like it's like we can also let it be really simple, and just do some of the simple practices, the low hanging fruit that we're going to most likely get the most benefit from. And those are the simple things, like the getting bare feet on the ground, getting morning light, maybe getting a little bit of cold, getting some exercise. For the vast majority of people, those things are going to make a huge difference in their lives.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Yeah, with the we're kind of bouncing all around here, but just to cycle back to the women and cold exposure, and a thought that I had around this, and I lead these year-long cohorts and training people around breath, around cold exposure. And this year's cohort, there's 12 people in the cohort, and 9 of them happen to be women. And
Huh.
so we've been really in this conversation of, is how does cold exposure affect women at different stages in their life
Oh
or
yeah.
different stages in their cycle?
Yep.
And I feel like, to say women shouldn't do cold exposure, there's like 6 different demographics within that. There's like premenopausal, there's perimenopausal, there's menopausal, there's postmenopausal, there's pregnant women, there's premenopausal women that might be on birth control. And every one of those is going to have a little bit different response to the cold and different hormone levels, and at different points in the cycle, basically from, trying to understand more deeply that aspect of it, really from all of the different women that I've been in conversation with, all of them have given me different answers, about how that stressor affects them at different points in their cycle. And so again, it just really brings it back to individual experience. But I think that the 2 demographics within that that seem to deal with it the best on a consistent basis are women that are on birth control and women that are postmenopausal because of where their hormones are at and that decrease in estrogen and having their hormones at a more consistent basis. And so I think, again, like to just broadly generalize women as one category really takes out the nuance of how to approach that from that perspective.
Well, yeah, just goes back exactly to the individualization of everything. And I mean, the reality is like, post or menopausal and postmenopausal women are going through these huge hormonal changes that we, are pretty definitively seeing that, hormone replacement therapy, et cetera, does wonders for women like that. And yet that is the exact thing you're talking about using cold to induce a lot of these hormonal, uh, aids per se that could come as a result of something like that. At any rate, it all, like that applies to men as well, just so we're clear. It's just dose response. Men's cycle is more of a 24-hour thing versus a monthly thing. So
Mm-hmm.
that's why, it's definitely, I think there's definite variation within that.
Mm-hmm.
However, it's all individualized, and it all comes down to the individual and learning about this whole thing by them, taking the time to do it in a very patient, structured way. And why?
Mm-hmm.
Why am I doing this?
Yeah.
And really digging down. But I really do believe that even below that why, there's a deeper, darker layer that most of us aren't willing to look at, which is that internal dialogue of, you know, where why might be coming from, or might be being influenced by, that isn't necessarily what people really want out of things.
Mm-hmm.
If they're not addressing that internal dialogue and that self-destructive process that really uh, is a part of all of us in some capacity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautifully said. And it's like it all comes back to the why, to the motivations. And what was that Bruce Lee quote that you shared on Chatterjee recently? The one about um, the the goal
Uh,
the goals apart
all,
from
all, go,
means are an
all goals
illusion.
apart from all goals apart from the means are an illusion. Becoming is a denial of being.
Yeah, yeah. And just recognizing that it's, it's all about the journey, and it's that individual journey that we all get to take, and we get to make our own decisions, and we get to learn from the consequences of those decisions.
Yes, if we
Yeah.
choose.
Everything's optional.
Everything is optional, pretty much.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right, buddy. Great conversation. It's great to see you.
Yeah.
Appreciate the
Thanks for
talk.
taking the time, Brian. Yeah, I really
Appreciate everybody
appreciate it.
coming, joining, and I'll post this up and invite you.
Amazing. Thank you.
Yep.
Take care.
Thanks.